is a place where we help people turn their fear into fuel and then find their purpose and their passion. What I want you to take away from this perspective, his perception, and really what the context of what I want to talk about in this episode is that perception is personal. It was shaped by our input somewhere along the way. And this is why in Rewired Experience, what I'm really talking about is changing your inputs. And by changing your inputs, it's the things you read, it's the things you listen to, it's your circle of friends, your direct influence in terms of the people you spend the most time with, things of that nature. We've got to be in this place for each other, right? You become the best version of you for me, and I'll become the best version of me. Have you ever judged someone without realizing the lens you were looking through, and that lens wasn't even necessarily yours? Or have you ever been judged by someone through a lens that maybe wasn't theirs, or maybe you felt was an unfair judgment or lens to be looked at through? I know people have been judged online. They've been judged by their peer groups, things of that nature. But what I'm really talking about today is perspective versus perception. And perspective as really a better place to be than perception. So what does it mean to be in perspective? Ultimately, I will say there's a huge difference, right, in being in perception versus being in perspective. And again, I feel like perspective is just a better place to be. And we'll talk about why here in just a second. But first of all, if you're new here, welcome to Rewired Experience Podcast. This is a place where we help people turn their fear into fuel and then find their purpose and their passion. And if you're in transition, if you're in a place where you just feel stuck, maybe you're moving on to a new chapter of your life, you're not quite sure what the next steps are, then this is a place for you. I'm Kyle Stoy. I'm a retired SWAT officer, retired police sergeant with 20 years, but I'm also a combat veteran. Did 100 combat missions in Afghanistan and definitely learned a lot of life lessons in that time in combat, in high stress environments, right? Tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving circumstances that taught me a lot, not only about myself, but about my limitations, about my weaknesses, about my strengths. And when I say not only about myself, those are the things I learned about myself, but I also learned a lot about people in general. And so I take those lessons that I learned and really try to translate them into this framework that I have for getting unstuck, moving on to that next stage. And I call that getting out of the suck. And the Rewired Experience framework: take an E, drink water, reshoot your azimuth, and Charlie Mike. Now, each one of those sounds like a bunch of military mumbo jumbo, I know, but each one of those things has its own place in the framework, its own job within the decision-making process. Today, I really want to take you back to when I was in Afghanistan, and I was on a mission, and we had just been engaged in a firefight, and I was standing with my interpreter, looking over a valley of this area we were in Afghanistan. It was really pretty beautiful in the moment. If I wasn't in a combat environment, right? Like, I think I definitely would have been thinking, what a beautiful place. And that was my perspective at the time, right? That was a healthy perspective, I think, but a great example of perspective over perception. I think that in that moment, and you can reference back, or I recommend go back. I did another episode called The Valley of Perspective in the audio podcast. So if you listen to the audio podcast, go back and listen to that one. You'll get even more kind of insight into how I got to this place where I'm standing there talking to my interpreter, looking over this valley. The thing that he said to me that really was a take a knee moment for me was when he said, he's just looking out over the valley and he says, I hate these people. And I was taken back. I'm sitting there thinking about how, like I said, how beautiful this valley is, even at night, even though we're in a war zone. I was like, what do you mean? You hate Afghanis? And he was like, no. How do you say? Hillbillies? I hate hillbillies. And man, it's hard for me to describe to you how many concepts, how many perspectives changed in that moment, how many ideologies, how many philosophies, how many paradigms just were shattered for me in that moment. Things just came together for me from a worldview perspective. And this is such a great example of what taking a knee actually is. Taking a knee is changing your perspective. And that input changed my perspective in a profound way. I didn't really say a whole lot in that moment, but I just processed what he meant. And what I understood about my interpreter is that he came from kind of privileged beginnings, right? I say that. Maybe not privileged beginnings, but for whatever reason, he was probably one of the few Afghanis at the time who'd had the opportunity to go to university, to learn different languages. Most of the Afghani people that were Dari or spoke the Dari dialect were fairly educated or came from money, is the easiest way for me to put it, right? Came from wealth, or at least maybe in the top 10 to 20%. I don't know the exact numbers, but the top to 20% of Afghani people. And that was his perception. That was his perception of the people, to break it down simply, who spoke those other dialects, who spoke the Pashtun. Primarily it was Pashtun, right? And Dari were the two primary dialects. But his belief system, his perception, had been shaped by his inputs. His inputs were, like I said, university education, his socio-political awareness, maybe his worldview, which they were all Muslim people. So they shared that in their worldview. But even with that, and that's very deeply entrenched, even with that worldview, they were still separated by socioeconomic status, by education and sociopolitical awarenesses and things of that nature. And really, he probably had more of a belief in a stronger centralized government. Like, those are probably his ideals, because he spent a lot of time in Kabul, which was the most modern city in Afghanistan. But what I want you to take away from this perspective, his perception, and really what the context, what I want to talk about in this episode, is that perception is personal. It was shaped by our input somewhere along the way. And this is why in Rewired Experience, what I'm really talking about is changing your inputs. And by changing your inputs, it's the things you read, it's the things you listen to, it's your circle of friends, your direct influence in terms of the people you spend the most time with, things of that nature, what you're scrolling on social media, what you're watching on Netflix, things of that nature. That is your perception. That's what shapes your perception. Now, ultimately, it decides your perspective if you let it. And that's the key. That's what we really want to take away from this, is we can't allow our inputs to affect our actual perspective, because perspective is positional. So if you think about perspective as being like a 30,000 foot view, right? It was me looking at the interpreter who was looking out over the valley, right? Like, I had an outside perspective. Outside perspectives are the most valuable because they're just not affected by inputs. They're not affected by perception. his only perspective had been shaped by his inputs, privilege, education, city life, all those things. And that's why he was saying what he was saying. But as I get into this, I'm going to tell you another story that ties into this. But number one, I'll let you know, this is what opened my eyes to tribal fragmentation, if you will, right? Not just in Afghanistan, but it opened me up to tribal fragmentation as it pertains to worldviews, ideologies, paradigms all across the world. A country can be united on paper, and that's the beauty of a covenant, constitutions, things of that nature. That is the beauty of them. They become the covenant that we all agree on. So if we can agree on the Bill of Rights, right? If we could just agree there, we can all have all sorts of different worldviews, different ideologies, different perceptions, as long as our perspective is like, these are non-negotiables, right? These things here are the non-negotiables. And I'll go into another story. So we were going into a Bedouin camp, and a Bedouin camp is, the easiest way, they're transient and they live in tents, right? They have pretty strict ideologies, pretty strict philosophies, even as it pertains to being Muslim. But I don't know a lot, but most of them I think you would consider fundamentalist, things like that. Maybe liking them to the Amish in the United States. That might be a good paradigm or a good metaphor. So I wanted to go to this Bedouin camp where these Bedouins had been probably about 1,500 meters or so from our combat outpost. We could see them from all of our positions, our security positions. And we'd go out there because I wanted to meet them. And I'd spent most of the time, so for the first probably 3 months, we'd been doing, just to let you know where we were at the time. We were doing about 5 combat patrols a day, rotationally, right? There was a combat patrol, then we'd have a squad on quick reaction force, standing by as a quick reaction force. We'd have a squad who was basically on work duty, whether they were cleaning or filling sandbags for strengthening and hardening defensive positions is primarily what they were doing. And then we had a squad who was on rest. And I think we did it in, 8 to 10 hour rotations. I can't remember exactly the breakdown. But just to kind of let you know where we were in terms of daily operations tempo, right? Like we were pretty ramped up. We'd been eating MREs for 121 days straight. We would go on to eat them for 121 days straight. But at this point, it was around, like I said, we'd been, I think, there for maybe 3 months or so. We kept up this op tempo. And we maybe hadn't even been at the combat outpost for maybe 2 months. I can't remember the exact time frame. But that's how long the Bedouins had been there. And we finally went out to go. I spent most of my time doing like key leader engagements, right? KLEs is what they were called. And so I spent most of my time talking to village elders, government officials, things like that nature. That was probably 80% of my time was going to these key leader engagements, talking to these leaders within the villages and things of that nature. So that being said, we're on this patrol. I'm going to go out. I'm hoping to make contact with the Bedouin village elder. And it's like 100 degrees. There's, it's, I don't know. I think it was July, maybe August, somewhere around there. So it's hot, right? It's definitely uncomfortable in combat gear. And we go into the Bedouin camp. First of all, I get my snipers in position and they're on Overwatch. And then once they're on Overwatch, we go into the camp and make contact with a younger individual, like military age individual in the Bedouin camp. And he's, hey, hold on, before you guys come into the camp, you're welcome to come in. But before you come into the camp, we need to hide the women, essentially, right? We're going to have the women go into the tents and things like that. So they do that, which was customary. That was typical of what they would do. And then we go to meet with the village elder. And I sit down with this village elder, and we're drinking hot chai tea in the 100-degree heat. They always serve it hot. They would bring candies, hard candies and hot chai tea. And so I'm sitting there, it was surreal. I'm sitting there having this conversation with this Bedouin in the middle of an Afghan valley, drinking chai tea. And I happen to notice that he has a prosthetic leg. And it's just really cheap. When you think about prosthetic legs, this had to be one of I don't know how long he'd had this, right? I could tell it was one of the older generations of prosthetics, right? Not anything modern that I'd seen. And I asked him, how'd you lose your leg? And he told me fighting the Russians. He was a Mujahideen fighter, and he lost his leg fighting the Russians for his people's sovereignty. And so that shed light on his perspective, first of all, right there. That shed immediate light on his perspective. So then the discussion moves into, I was talking to him about some mandates of President Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, the supposedly democratically elected president of Afghanistan. And he stopped me and he said, hey, Karzai is not the president of Afghanistan. He's the president of Kabul. And this is what I took away from that. He wasn't anti-government necessarily because he was a rebel. He was anti-government because he felt forgotten. He felt marginalized. And that hit me because that was powerful perspective. And if you think about, without going into a whole lot of detail, if you think about the climate of the presidential elections in recent years, and really, I think what rallied the populist base to get out and vote in this last presidential election, you can really compare these rural areas, beyond rural to what our consideration is or what our perception is. They were probably not included in that voting. They wouldn't have had the ability. I'm sure a lot of people did travel into Kabul to try to vote. But my perspective that was given to me in his statement was that he probably didn't have a chance to participate. And so he said Karzai is the president of Kabul, meaning the people of Kabul elected him, not the people of Afghanistan. So that's what democracy looks like to people in rural areas. And this is why I think things like the Electoral College, representative governments, things like that are so important, because there are these people in these that are going to live out in the middle of nowhere. And for the most part, they want to be left alone. And I'm shocked. I feel like a lot of the upheaval, you think about the people in North Carolina that were displaced by the floods and things like that. There's a little bit of it coming from the actual people, but mostly the outrage is coming from other politicians. Maybe their representatives, organizations, things like that. But I think there's a large percentage of those people that really don't want the government's help. And I don't know what percentage that would be. And I'm not even saying it's the majority, but I bet there's a few. I bet there's a lot, probably more than what we're seeing in mainstream news media or even independent news media, honestly, because it's really political fodder, right? Like they want you to think that these people had been left out to dry by a partisan government. And while that may be true, I think there's just as many people who probably want to be left alone, right? And would just assume rebuild on their own and not have any ties or loyalty to this partisan tribal movement, right? And I think that's what the Bedouins represented. So again, that's just a great comparison, this elder's experience to rural America and who feel unheard or underrepresented. And then you can see the same thing in my interpreter's absolute disdain for people like that Mujahideen fighter that wanted nothing more than his sovereignty for his people. So the perception of my interpreter was these backwards freaking hillbillies. But the perspective was these hillbillies are sovereign and they don't really want to be governed, right? And I think that's important to understand really the difference between perception, which is the lens through which we see reality, and that's affected by input. So how do we change that into perspective? Really, we've got to take a knee. And take a knee while that's a metaphor in the sense that like you're not actually going to take a knee, it's a powerful metaphor because you're actually changing your position. It's the position in how you view something. So sometimes getting lower gives you a better perception. Sometimes getting higher gives you a better perception. And you can read into that what you will. But perspective is often influenced by more tangible, objective things like geography, your roles, power, right? Your position in leadership, your lived experience versus maybe your education, because education is philosophy, right? That's not necessarily lived experience. Inputs from your family, your friends, things like that, that's them imparting their beliefs on you. Right? And it may not even align with your feelings. And that's why sometimes I feel like it's better to feel than it is to believe when it comes to negative things, and better to believe when it comes to positive things than to feel, right? Because belief ultimately is way more powerful than feelings. Feelings can change. Belief can change also if you change your perspective, but belief is much more active in the actual outcomes of your life. So if perception is the lens, like I said, then perspective is going to be the elevation. And sometimes, like I said, being higher up or being lower down, it doesn't necessarily mean you're seeing more clearly. But I think seeing both are important. We walk around high. And when we change our perspective, when we take a knee, sometimes we see things more clearly than we do when we're walking around on two legs. It doesn't necessarily mean, again, that you're seeing more clearly, but it may mean that you're further removed from the reality depending on your position. And I think as human beings, we've got to be in this place for each other, right? You become the best version of you for me, and I'll become the best version of me for you. And that starts with changing our perspective. Can I look at it through your lens to maybe see your perception to change my perspective? Can you look at something through my lens to see my perception to change your perspective? It's hard to do. I get it. But it's definitely possible. You can apply this in so many different things. You can apply it in leadership to understand the people you're leading, to understand their perspective. And don't just assume things. Your perception could be wrong. Their perception could be wrong. It's where communication comes in. You got to talk. The only way that I'm going to be able to see your perception to come into perspective is if we have a conversation about what your perception is. The only way I could understand the perception of that Mujahideen fighter was to have a conversation with him. And the conversation that I had with my interpreter, those two conversations changed my entire perspective and my involvement in mission focus in Afghanistan. In relationships, before you judge a spouse or a teammate, a client, a friend, whatever, where are they standing? How are they seeing the situation? What's their philosophy? What perceptions are you clinging to that might be affecting your relationships? What perceptions are you clinging to that may be affecting how you look at money, how you look at time, how you look at success, how you value yourself and others? How can you let go of those perceptions by taking on somebody else's perspective? Your job isn't to judge someone else's perception. So don't come into this being judgmental of another person's perception. I wasn't judgmental of my interpreter. It just gave me an opportunity to get a different perspective. I wasn't judgmental of the Bedouin village leader who said he didn't believe in the governance that the United States has just assisted in installing or helping to install through a quote-unquote democratic process. I didn't judge him for that, but I did allow myself into his perspective. Both of those perspectives were valuable, not only in understanding what was going on in Afghanistan at the time, but then also what was going on at home and what continues to go on in the geopolitical environment. It's really about people who cannot get out of perception and into perspective. So if you value this message and maybe this has resonated with you, I'd love for you to go over to rewiredexperience.com. Pretty much any call to action button you hit in that website is going to take you to our new school community, Rewired Experience School Community. We just launched it. It's pretty small, but man, there's a lot of great conversations happening in there that are changing people's perspective. And we're not only changing their perspective on money, on relationships, on health, we're changing their perspective on each other and on themselves, their perspective about themselves, their self-value, their self-worth. And if that's something that you're looking for, go to rewiredexperience.com, click on any of those call to action buttons on the website. It's going to take you directly to our school group. Fill out a few questions. It's a private group. We'll let you in. We'll invite you into the family, and we'll change our perspective together. So until next time, take a knee, drink water, reshoot your azimuth, and Charlie Mike.